हथेलिया की मेहंदी हल्की होए के गया।
Uprooted, we have survived. The piercing morning, we have survived. Deaths in the Baghdans and hovels of hope, we have survived. We are the surviving, we who know the snake's fangs, the tides and the season's treachery, the boots, the fists, the spit of the British Empire.
These readings consist of edited extracts from two main sources. The first is a chapter in the Guyanese historian Professor Clem Seecharan's book, Finding Myself, Essays on Race, Politics and Culture. The chapter is entitled Indians in Guyana, an Overview. The second main source is Gaiutra Bahadur's Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, a chronicle of the journey of her great-grandmother, Seecharan, and a meditation on the indentured, particularly the females among them, and the system of indenture. As she writes, my father knew that his grandmother, Seecharan, had climbed aboard the Clyde, a pregnant woman, traveling alone. Seecharan had given birth to my grandfather at some point during the passage from India and had given him the name Lal Bahadur. Poems and prose writing are drawn from David Dabydeen and Brinsley Samaru's India in the Caribbean and the People Tree anthology, They Came in Ships.
Indentured lives in dates and distances, not in the antic dance we dance. Speech which speaks our death, in postures of greed and denial. Pain which strikes in the striking of each stricken hour.
We begin with the words of Rajkumari Singh, a Guyanese poet writing in the 1970s.
It all started with our forefathers. Remember, this is the name our hardworking, economy-building forefathers were called. Coolie. Think of the word. Mull over this word. What does it mean to you? Does it not make you aware of the hardships and trials, mental and physical, that our grandmothers and grandfathers experienced? Does it not remind you that they were brought from their far-off motherland to save ours from total economic collapse following the slave emancipation experience? The word brings to mind rows and rows of toilers, coolie men and women with soft mud squelching between their toes, up to their breasts in water, planting rice. And when the pregnant paddy sheaves bend low with their grain burden, do you not recall the bent, emaciated bodies of the toilers, their premature old age because of water, of bending, of intense tropical sun heat? Did not these coolies plant sugarcane, fields and fields of swaying sugarcane, to give the taste of sweetness to us and to all sorts of people all over the world? And let us not forget how often this sweetness became bitter gall to them for seeking their rights. Surely you cannot forget Paraji, our great coolie grandmother, squatting in her haunches, blowing through the pukni to help the chulha fire blaze so that your parents and mine could have a hot sada roti and aloo choka before they leave for the fields. Can't you hear her bangles tingling as she grinds the garam masala to make her curries unforgettable? All this they gave us and more. In return for our heritage, what greater tribute can we pay to them than to keep alive the name of which they were called? Coolie is a beautiful word that conjures up poignancy, tears, defeats, achievements. The word must not be left to die out. Remember the Hesperus and Whitby? They came with blowing sails, riding the waves of our coffee-tinted Atlantic to unload their precious cargo on our Guyana. Not only in the Guyana context must Coolie be given new meaning, but in every land in the Caribbean Sea, the Indian Ocean, the seas of the East, in Africa and Europe, proclaim the word, identify the word, proudly say to the world, I am a Coolie.
Gaiutra speaks about the origin and use of the word.
Coolie comes from the Tamil word coolie, meaning wages or hire. It was first used in the late 16th century by Portuguese captains and merchants along the Coromandel coast in India, who passed it on to the other Europeans who vied with them to control the lucrative trade with the subcontinent. They all described the men who worked for them, carrying loads at the docks, as coolies. Gradually, the word took on the broader meaning of someone paid to do menial work. After the enslaved were emancipated in the 1830s, the British began to rustle up replacement workers for plantations worldwide. This was the epithet they used for the indentured laborers they enlisted. Ultimately, over the course of 8 decades, they ferried more than 1 million coolies to more than a dozen colonies across the globe, including British Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, Suriname, Mauritius, and Fiji. These were the first group of Indians abroad in any significant numbers, the vanguard of a larger, broader diaspora that India presently views with pride, courts and cultivates, but who were denigrated at the time. Imperial bureaucrats imposed the coolie label on a wide group of native people from many castes and occupational backgrounds. Most indentured laborers would not have used the word to describe themselves. They registered their protests in folk songs sung for generations. One, composed in British Guyana, asked, "Why should we be called coolies, we who were born in the clans and families of seers and saints?" They felt mislabeled and degraded. As tensions simmered between Africans and Indians during the indenture era and beyond, coolie became an ethnic slur, a reminder to Indians of menial origins and a subtle challenge to their claim to belong. Coolie was so loaded a word that in 1956, Trinidad's future prime minister urged his countrymen to banish it, along with the N word from their vocabularies. This was during the height of the anti-colonial struggle, and Eric Williams was calling on Trinidadians to cast off 2 varieties of hate inculcated by colonizers: hate for each other and hate for themselves. A movement to reclaim the word coolie, to invest it with pride and subvert the old stigma, is at least a generation old. In the early 1970s, Guyanese poet Rajkumari Singh issued a call: proclaim the word, identify with the word, proudly say to the world, I am a coolie. David Dabydeen, born and raised in Guyana, heeded the call a decade later with poems bearing titles such as Coolie Odyssey and Coolie Mother. Coolie may bear a jagged edge like a broken bottle raised in threat, but it also ricochets still down dirt lanes in the Guyanese village where I was born, in far more complicated ways, in greetings that are sometimes menacing, but also often affectionate and intimate. Much depends on who is using the word and why. I have chosen to employ it because it is true to my subject. My great-grandmother was a high-caste Hindu. That is a fact. But she left India as a coolie. That is also a fact. She was one individual swept up in a particular mass movement of people, and the perceptions of those who controlled that process determined her identity, at least as much as she did. The power of her colonizers to name and misname her formed a key part of her story. To them, she was a coolie woman, a stock character possessing stereotyped qualities. The word coolie carries the baggage of colonialism on its back. It bears the burdens of history.
थी और सास का महल अंशवर खिला समझाता है.
Clem Seecharan writes,
Guyana, British Guyana, until the 26th of May 1966, though situated on the northeastern shoulder of South America, is considered a part of the Caribbean because of its strong historical links with the archipelago of islands to the north. Occupied by the Dutch in the late 16th, early 17th century, it required monumental efforts to colonize it. Only the Dutch, with their peerless mastery of empowering and access to enslaved African labor, could have constructed and maintained the astounding labyrinthine system of dams, embankments, canals, drains, ditches, cokers, or sluices, without which the coastal land is uninhabitable. Because of this inauspicious beginning, Guyana never became a mature slave society like Jamaica, Barbados, or the Leeward Islands. Yet it engendered a rebellious spirit among the enslaved. Because of Guyana's relative underdevelopment, when emancipation came in the 1830s, freed Africans were able to buy land away from the sugar plantations to create their own villages. This was the source of the militancy of the African people in the 1840s, as they sought to enhance their bargaining position with the planters. In 1842, in the counties of Demerara and Essequibo, they went on strike when the planters reduced wages unilaterally. The workers were able to force a reversal of the wage slash. In 1848, however, when African workers took similar action against another wage slash, the planters successfully resisted their demands. They had been fortifying themselves since 1845, having introduced over 11,000 indentured laborers from India and more than 10,000 from Madeira. The plantocracy were resolved to halt the demonstrated capacity of Africans to negotiate wage waves on their terms. Indian indentureship, therefore, was introduced specifically to enable sugar plantations to retain a body of contract labor, boncoolies, in a colony where the freed African people were erroneously perceived to have abundant options for independent livelihood. Moreover, the fact that 1/3 of the funding of indentureship originated from general revenue, to which Africans contributed through high indirect taxation on foodstuff, meant they were, in reality, subsidizing a system designed to curb their fledgling assertion of rights. This was the context of African perception of Indian indentureship as irreconcilably subversive of their welfare. Immeasurably more than in environmentally gentler Trinidad, every perceptible advance by Indians would evoke and reinforce those sentiments. The sense of being a victim was magnified and perpetuated by this hard land in the graphic imagery of the historian James Rodway. Every acre at present in cultivation has been the scene of the struggle, with the sea in front and the flood behind. As a result, this arduous labor, African, during 2 centuries, a narrow strip of land along the coast has been rescued from the mangrove swamp and kept under cultivation by an elaborate system of dams and dikes. Scattered along the rivers and creeks lie 1,000 abandoned plantations, most of them indistinguishable from the surrounding forests. When all the circumstances were taken in consideration, it is almost a wonder that British Guyana has not been abandoned altogether. In 1943, Dr. F.C. Benham calculated that the cost of maintaining the hydraulic systems on the plantations that year alone was $459,000, or $2.79 per ton of sugar produced. Each square mile of cane cultivation involves the provision of 49 miles of drainage canals and ditches and 16 miles of high-level waterways. If these figures are raised to cover the whole area under cane, and the sum total approaches 5,000 miles. Some estates do, in fact, have more than 300 miles in waterways to maintain. This is incomprehensible to outsiders. Guyanese still take it for granted at their peril. Quote, this meant that slaves moved 100 million tons of heavy waterlogged clay with shovel in hand, while enduring conditions of perpetual mud and water. It required coarse labor to sustain the effort, but it was also necessary to create El Dorado here. Guyana needed and still needs myth to provoke effort. Fantasy is endemic to its psyche. It breeds inexhaustible visions of riches in the bush. Ever since Sir Walter Raleigh's delusional quest for El Dorado, Guyana's maidenhead has been on the verge of being penetrated. Fantasy found a hospitable space in the imagination of the colony's indentured laborers from India. It would vacillate between the exuberant and the melancholy. Because of African repugnance up to indentureship, it was difficult for Indians to abjure the stubborn lore that they took bread out of the mouths of Africans. Therefore, they would continually deny agency for their migration to the colony. They would attribute it to kidnapping, to trickery, to being duped into going to distant lands. The blame would fall on their evil Arkati, the recruiter who allegedly stole them all from their villages. They would seek double billing in the historiography of oppression. They would cultivate the myth that indentureship was a new system of slavery.
Gaiutra explains.
Recruiters lived in the local imagination as schemers, liars, even kidnappers. And they exaggerated the gains to be had, inflating wages and conjuring lands of milk, honey, and gold. In Coolie folk songs, the recruiter is a cursed and vilified figure. The cry of one song is, "O recruiter, your heart is deceitful, your speech is full of lies." In the tales of leaving India handed down to the generations, chance encounters with recruiters who exploited misfortune feature regularly. The great-grandmother of the Guyanese poet, Rajkumari Singh, was on a pilgrimage with relatives when she and her son became separated from the group. Puljari was a woman of high status, the widow of a wealthy landowner and the daughter of a Brahmin priest. A recruiter promised to help her locate her relatives. Days later, she found herself in an emigration depot in Calcutta. There was particular incentive for recruiters to ensnare women because the emigration agencies paid higher bounties for female recruits. The year Sujaria sailed, 76% of female recruits were somehow allowed to go alone. So desperate were British administrators for female recruits, they may have bent rules to get them. There may have been lies told about the women's identities and origins, both by recruiters and the women themselves.
Says Gaiutra.
Rural India in the 19th and early 20th centuries was the scene of epic uprooting.
Clem Seecharan writes.
About 85% of the immigrants to Guyana originated in the same region, Eastern United Provinces and Western Bihar. The impoverished eastern districts of United Provinces alone contributed 70.3%, while 15.3% were from the contiguous western districts of Bihar.
Gaiutra resumes.
A wide array of social and economic deprivations drove villagers from home. The practice of imperial capitalism destroyed traditional livelihoods, plunging weavers into unemployment, flooding India with factory-made textiles from England. At the same time, colonialism created new routes for moving across the subcontinent. By the mid-1800s, the British had recruited 10,000 sepoys for their army from Saran, a district in Bihar. In times of famine, peasants tramped the roads in search of work, sometimes all the way to growing metropolises such as Calcutta in the Bengal Presidency. India suffered 24 famines in the last quarter of the 19th century, more than enough to cause sustained large-scale displacement. The simple fact is, my great-grandmother had already quit her village before she quit India. She was 160 miles away in the town of Faizabad when she was registered to emigrate. Faizabad sat just across a guava orchard from the bigger, more densely populated town of Ayodhya, a place of pilgrimage for Hindus, who believed the god Ram was born there. In the late 19th century, the area was known as a magnet for wanderers. Temples and holy sites, then as now, were natural places for runaways to seek refuge and alms. Labor recruiters looking for people desperate enough to cross the Indian Ocean found them in exactly such places. That she was registered near there raises questions. Why was she so far from home? Had the crops failed in Gurahupur? Was she looking for work? Had she run from mistreatment, or was she thrown out for transgressing? In short, was she a victim? Or had she taken charge of her own destiny?
याद करके ऐसा वासना का महल जगत में खड़ा है.
One scholar of Indenture has remarked that the British didn't recruit coolies for their sugarcane fields. Rather, they made coolies. By this logic, the system took gardeners, palanquin bearers, goldsmiths, cow miners, leather makers, boatmen, soldiers, and priests with centuries-old identities based on religion, kin, and occupation, and turned them all into an indistinguishable, degraded mass of plantation laborers without caste or family. This reverse alchemy began at Garden Reach, as the emigrants ate and slept side by side, violating the taboos and rules that had so far governed their lives. For weeks, sometimes months, the emigrants slept in sheds with palm leaf roofs. When they first arrived, the emigrants were stripped of their own clothes and given soap to wash in a hooghly again, side by side, the concerns of caste seemingly disappearing down the river, like the sacred thread that one migrant saw some high caste Hindus discard as they bathed in 1898. There was good reason for those men to let slip down river the thread, called the Janu. Brahmin boys received it as part of their ritual initiation into manhood at the age of 13. Brahmins probably knew they were unwanted. Planters saw them as unfit for hard labor in the fields and moreover as a potential threat to their authority. Those who abandoned the Janu must have known it would betray them to government doctors, instructed to check for the soft disqualifying hands of Brahmins. Those bound for the West Indies were given new and unfamiliar clothes for the cold, rough weather they would encounter around Africa's southern tip. The regulations allotted women 2 flannel jackets, a woolen petticoat, and worsted stockings, as well as a sari, while men received wool trousers, a red woolen cap, and a jacket. Sometimes the jacket was the hand-me-down scarlet tunic of a British soldier. Sometimes there were no trousers but a dhoti, the loose cloth with which men in village India typically girded their loins. Whether traditional in style or Western, and whether of good quality or literally rotten, the clothes issued to any particular group of migrants were identical. They were uniform. A folk song sung in British Guyana for generations captures the emigrants' sense that they were denuded of their identities, disrobed and degraded at the depot. It goes, "When we reached Calcutta, our miseries increased. We were stripped of all our beautiful clothes, rosary beads and sacred threads. Bengali rags decorated us now. The sadhu's hair was shaved, and sadhu, dom, chamar, and bangai all were thrown together in a room. Munshi Raman Khan was an indentured emigrant who witnessed the Janus being discarded in 1898. He denounced the depot as a place where higher caste Hindus began to lose their religion. Though he was Muslim, this seemed to violate his own sense of the universe's code. Many decades later, he wrote, "These people resorted to infidelity. They did not hesitate to have other women from different castes and creed to keep them company. They were also very close and intimate with the untouchables, and ate, drank, and had fun with them, and started relations with their womenfolk. Most men had left their own wives behind in their villages, as migrant laborers all over have done for centuries, and most women had left their husbands behind, if they had not already lost them to famine, migration, or other women. The history books tell us that the uncoupled regularly became coupled in the depots, out of convenience or necessity. Women perhaps calculated that it would help to have a protector on the journey ahead, and men may have seen the benefits of having someone to cook and care for them where they were going. New husbands and wives were regularly taken, without ceremony or priestly sanction, across castes and religion."
याद करके ऐसा वासना का महल जगत में भरा है.
Gaiutra Bahadur writes,
Some historians have called indenture a new form of slavery. In many ways, it was. Once in the sugar colonies, coolies suffered under a repressive legal system that regularly convicted more than a fifth of them as criminals. The story, however, is more nuanced than that, especially for women. From the beginning, in all the colonies that turned to indenture to rescue their plantations from ruin after slaves were freed, men enormously outnumbered women. This gave women some sexual leverage. They could take new partners, and frequently they did. Theirs was often a tale of leaving their country, then leaving their men. Even before leaving their country, many had left their men. I don't know whether my great-grandmother had intentionally left hers. If she was recruited with a husband, she lost him somewhere along the way.
Clem Seecharan disagrees.
It is wrong to label indentureship as new slavery. However oppressive the conditions in the aftermath of emancipation in 1838, a definite instrument of rejecting this common characterization was the contract all indentured laborers were required to sign in India before embarkation of the plantation colonies. It is arguable that those terms were often more honored in the breach, and that it took decades for the contract in its most benign form to evolve. However, implicit in the signing of a contract was the notion of Indian indentured laborers as free agents with rights. Enslaved Africans had no such concession to their humanity. They were property, deprived of the fruits of labor and their autonomy as individuals for life, with no recourse to law or any statutory protector. It is therefore erroneous to equate Indian indentureship with African slavery. The indentureship contract evolved over time, but the basic terms were established by the 1870s. After completing 5 years of indentureship with a registered employer and a total of 10 years of continuous residence in the colony, and having procured a certificate of exemption from labor, Indians were entitled to a free return passage. The immigrant had to work every day except Sundays or authorized holidays, 7 hours in the field and 10 hours in the factory. Able-bodied males 16 years and over were paid 1 shilling per day. Adult males, not able-bodied, minors, and above 10 years of age were under 16, and female adults were paid 8 pence per day, but were entitled to extra pay when working beyond the stipulated hours. The contract legitimized child labor. Indentured laborers also had the option to task work. This was one of the most contentious issues as workers continually contested on the basis on which earnings from task work were calculated. Unlike enslaved Africans, Indians had recourse to the immigration agent general or his district agents, protectors, authorized to visit plantations to investigate specific complaints. Indentured laborers were allowed to visit the office of the protector to seek redress of grievances. Between 1874 and 1895, only 208 employers were prosecuted successfully. On the other hand, 65,084 indentured laborers were convicted of breaches of labor laws. Indian indentureship in Guyana lasted over 75 years. Genuine social and economic reasons impelled a minority of enterprising men and women to flee their desert of hope in eastern Uttar Pradesh and western Bihar. Hunger, chronic deaths, famine, cholera, and smallpox epidemics, young girls widowed in their early teens, etc. Most were not kidnapped or tricked by the infamous recruiters, the Harkatis, into bondage, but these were desperate people.
The very summer Sujari across the Atlantic, a debate was raging over a law intended to keep married women from deserting their homes for the colonies. No woman could emigrate without her husband's permission. If she claimed to be single, and officials thought she was lying, she could be detained for up to 10 days as constables checked her story. Robert Mitchell, the man in Calcutta who had been in charge of securing immigrants for British Guyana for 2 decades, complained that the law was being applied too religiously. Mitchell was furious. Because of the way the law was being applied, he couldn't muster enough women to meet his quota. No ship could sail unless there were 40 women for every 100 men among the coolies it carried. From his office along the Holy River, Mitchell pleaded his case to officials in London, Guyana, and India's hinterlands. It had rained that season in the district embracing Faizabad. It was drought and famine that made Mitchell's depot hum with recruits. Mitchell knew that, and he knew that if men were going to be tough to recruit, women could be even tougher. Migrating overseas to work had always been a mostly male enterprise the world over. And then there were the cultural barriers against Indian women crossing the threshold of home into the world. It proved so hard to get enough of them to dispatch the season's first ship that when the urn finally sailed, some of the women aboard had been in the depot for almost a year. Meanwhile, Mitchell fretted that the season's second ship would probably leave late, and even then, with well fewer than the 649 adults it could hold. That ship, as it turned out, was the Clyde, and it sailed with 560 adults. My great-grandmother was one of its last-minute catches.
Because 90% of girls were married between 10 and 14, according to the UP census of 1891. It is probable that most of the indentured women who declared themselves single were, in fact, widowed because of the high mortality of child husbands in the 19th century. Some may have been deserted by husbands who found migratory employment in Assam and Bengal and never kept in touch. Even in their parents' village, a widowed girl was socially dead. Many women succumbed to despair. A minority did not. But both men and women often had a lot to hide. A collective amnesia cohered quickly, a watertight instinct to forget. People have a remarkable capacity to unlearn. The past in India had to be reimagined in Guyana.
The archives leaves gaps. Missing, with few exceptions, are the voices of the women themselves. They did not leave behind diaries or letters. The vast majority wasn't literate in English or in any Indian language. They did not tell their own stories, except indirectly, through the often biased prism of government investigators and court officials who occasionally took their testimonies. The relative silence of Coolie women in the sum total of history reflects their lack of power. But could it also reflect a strategy by women who had secrets to keep? Is it possible that on some level, each individual silence was a plan?
Oh, Coolie girl with eyes of wonder, with thoughtful brows and lips compressed. I know not where your thoughts do wander. I know not where your heart doth rest. This land of mud has been your home. 'Twas here you drew your natal breath. Then why so foreign, why so strange, in looks and manner, style and dress, religion too, and social ways, thy mystery I cannot guess.
बंद रहेगी तो मिथियार सास का महल अंशवर खिला समझाता है.
V.S. Naipaul, born 1932, recalls of his Trinidadian boyhood. To me, India seemed very far away, mythical. But we were at that time only 40 or 50 years out of India. The Ramayana was the essential Hindu story. It lived among us the way epics lived. It had a strong and fast and rich narrative, and even with the divine machinery, the matter was very human. The characters and their motives could always be discussed. The epic was like a moral education for all of us. It was easier to appropriate and imagine India from this great Hindu classic rather than Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. The latter have no resonance whatsoever in the lands where Indian indentured laborers settled. The Indo-Guyanese universe would be permeated by the mythical. The Indian of the Ramayana, reinforced by Ram Leela festivals, the dramatization of the text fed the imagination. It was the real homeland. It spoke of a golden age. It helped them to forget the recent past. It also absorbed pain and loss, the gnawing guilt, like the images of Bollywood from the 1930s onward. It was escapism fantasy. The real India was too evocative of recent traumas. For most, a terminal break with all relatives, the abdication of communal responsibilities, the consuming poverty that killed young husbands, wives, and children, the widowing of young child brides, and the implacable stigma, the pervasive servitude of spirit. The appeal of the Ramayana is rooted in its narrative of exile, redemption, triumphal return, and the arrival of an age of splendor, the rule of Lord Rama. The Ramayana offered a sustaining vision.
Ancestral memory had told my family the story of who we are. Brown-skinned people with many gods and peculiar stubborn habits. It had told it imperfectly. Memory, after all, fails us. That we expect, especially over generations and across oceans. Details get smudged and dialogue garbled. The will to remember the past is undermined by an equally formidable will to forget. An emigration pass issued to my great-grandmother on 29th of July 1903, the day she sailed from Calcutta for the Caribbean. Name? Shiojari, age 27, height 5 feet 4.5 inches, caste Brahman. Here was colonial officialdom's cold summary of an indentured laborer's life. Yet, it included strokes of unsettling intimacy. The emigration pass told me that my great-grandmother had a scar on her left foot, a burn mark. Someone had scribbled pregnant 4 months in pencil at the document's edge. On the line for husband's name, there was only a dash. The Shiojari catalogued as a passenger on the Clyde was called Sujaria in Guyana. In Bihar, she would have been known as Shivajaro, or follower of the god Shiva. British officials registering her for the West Indies could have misheard her name, or she could simply have lied about it. Sujaria was a passenger on the Clyde and also part of its cargo. The iron sailing ship, owned by Welshman James Norris, ran a regular route between the West Indies and India, exchanging salt and railway iron for coolies. The British traffic in indentured servants was a third the size of its trade in African slaves, whom the Indian laborers succeeded on plantations across the globe. From 1838 to 1917, the British transported 1 million Indians, half of them to the Caribbean, to grow and cut sugarcane.
Indians on the plantations resisted and often encountered brutal reprisals. They combined passive forms of resistance with active ones. Because of poor wages and a perception that their contracts were not being honored, desertions were common between 1876 and 1910. There were 20,058. But in July 1869, at Plantation Lenora, a tradition of militancy was born. As their Mangru observes, at Lenora, about 40 workers of the shovel gang complained that their wages were withheld for non-completion of an assigned task on waterlogged soil. They became violent, assaulted the deputy manager, and confronted the police, who were armed with Enfield rifles. The next near violence was more widespread, enveloping plantations Hague, Eiflat, Monrepos, Nonprel, Virginusian, and Success. A strike at Devonshire Castle in October 1872 would prove fatal, establishing a pattern in Indo-Guyanese resistance. 5 were killed and 7 wounded. Workers would complain about inadequate earnings, their grievances deemed spurious by managers. They were often sought redress by marching to the office of the Immigration Agent General or one of his district agents. The police would be called in to stop the march. Tempers became inflamed, culminating in workers being fatally shot by the police. Men and women resisted. Resistance to perceived injustices was a fact of Indian life on the estates. Between 1886 and 1889, no less than 100 strikes were recorded. Virtually every year, there were strikes on the sugar plantations. This was a culture of resistance. Apart from the shootings at Rose Hall in 1930, strikes were comparatively rare in the county of Berbice. Infamous exceptions were Mara and Friends, dying estates in the derelict riverine district. Workers on these 2 estates had no rice lands. Accommodation between workers and management was generally more commonplace in Berbice. Possibilities for supplementing wages were greater. Because of the difficulty of reclaiming land, many more Indians in Guyana, Hindus and Muslims, remained on the plantations than in Trinidad. This was fostered unprecedented solidarity between them. The plantation other is more enduring. Community spirit has transcended ancient religious incomprehension. This was the foundation of the mobility aspirations of many Indo-Guyanese, conducive to the rise of a middle class based on rice, cattle, commerce, and Western education.
Mother. Jasmati lived in brown hot, big like butter shoebox, beat clothes, weed yard, chop wood, feed fowl for this body and that body and every blasted body, fetch water, all day fetch water, like if the whole slow-flowing Kanji River God create just for she one own bucket, till she foot bottom crack and she hand cut up, and the curse swarm from her mouth like red ants, and she cough blood on the ground, but mash it in, because Jasmati heart hard, she mind set hard, the hustle saved her one slow penny, because one dotty make bam cross the Kanji, and son Harry Lal got to go to school in Georgetown, must wear clean starch pants or they get laugh at he, strap leather on his foot, and he must read book, learn talk proper, take exam, go to England University, not turn out like a rumsucker chama daddy.
बिना एक ही देश वह खुले से उड़ता है नदी जल की तरह.
Wet rice culture was transplanted here and soon became a successful venture. By 1903, 17,500 acres were being cultivated. Most of the rice was grown in villages in the vicinity of plantations. The gradual reform of laws relating to the purchase of crown lands during the 1890s, when the sugar industry faced a prolonged crisis, precipitated a significant rise in the land owning among Indians. Numerous predominantly Indian villages emerged in all three counties, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice. However, the acquisition of some land formerly owned by Africans in the villages tended to exacerbate the latter's fear of Indian ascendancy, deepening the resentment spawned by indentureship. It was during the First World War, with the inaccessibility of rice from India and Burma, that Indians in Guyana stepped in to fulfill the vacuum. The progress of the rice industry was accompanied by the progressive rise of cattle rearing by Indians. The Indian middle class had its origin in the rice and cattle industries, bolstered by the advancement of those who had progressed further into commerce in Georgetown, the capital, and Amsterdam, the main town in Berbice. Major reason for the rise of the entrepreneurial elite was the consolidation of the joint family as a corporate economic unit by the First World War. The family functioned as a corporate economic unit. It was the key instrument in exploiting diverse niches in the Guyanese coastal environment. The paternal familias could seek to mobilize family labor for a range of seasonal economic activities. In the villages, especially family labor, male and female, was deployed into rice, cattle, market gardening, sometimes rural commerce, a general store, or a rum shop. In poorer families, work in the villages was supplemented with strategic employment on the sugar estates during the cane harvest. Ban for walk. Aiman, Kuliman, ban for walk, cut bush, bun bush, block dotty, wet me hand with white saliva. Aiman, Kuliman, ban for walk, plant rice, cut rice, fetch rice, soak me toe with mud water. Aiman, Kuliman, ban for walk, plant cane, cut cane, fetch cane, soak me hand with salt water. Aiman, Kuliman, ban for walk, plant baji, cut baji, sell baji, soak me skin with drain water. Aiman, Kuliman, ban for walk. Walk can we walk can we walk, till walk frighten me.
कबीर कहे